If you've ever wondered what it was like to live under kings whose ambition and ruthlessness shaped entire kingdoms, this journey is for you. Tonight, we'll drift slowly through the lives of the most terrible Viking rulers, from Canute the Great to Harald Hardrada and the warlords who ruled in their shadows. Imagine longships slicing through northern waters, halls filled with strategy and intrigue, and the quiet moments where power and fear intertwined. Settle in, breathe deeply, and let the echoes of history guide you into a world of ambition, conquest, and legend. So before you settle in, take a breath. If you enjoy long walks through the dust of history, you can gently tap subscribe. It helps me keep these journeys going, but only if it feels right. On Lindisfarne, the days began in darkness. Before the sun rose above the sea, the monks were already awake, rising from their hard wooden beds in cells that smelled of candle smoke and salt air. They filed into the chapel in silence, their woolen robes brushing against the stone floor. The bell rang, its sound carrying over the water, startling gulls from the rocks. In the faint glow of lanterns, they chanted psalms, the words echoing through the small stone church. Outside, the sea pushed and pulled against the shore with the same rhythm it had carried since the beginning of time. The life of a monk was slow, but it was never idle. After prayer came labor. Some tended gardens, turning soil with spades, planting cabbages and onions to feed the community. Others cared for sheep, their wool clipped and spun into thread that clothed the brethren. In the scriptorium, scribes bent low over desks, painstakingly copying the Gospels. Each page was a world of color, with swirling reds, deep blues, and shimmering gold leaf. The monks believed their work echoed eternity, for to copy the word of God was to carry it forward into the ages. Meals were simple: a piece of bread, a bowl of pottage, sometimes fish or cheese. They ate in silence, listening to readings of scripture as they chewed. Their lives were not comfortable in the way kings and nobles lived, but for men who sought holiness, it was enough. The rhythm of bells, the cycle of prayer and labor, the steady beating of waves against the shore, this was their world. But far to the north, beyond the horizon, a different world was stirring. In the fjords of Norway, villages clung to rocky shores where farmland was scarce and winters were long. Families carved a living from fishing and hunting, from tending small fields, from raiding their neighbors when survival demanded it. The sea was not something to fear, but something to master. Children learned to row as soon as they could walk. The longhouse was warm with firelight, filled with smoke and the smell of dried fish. Outside, ships were being built, their keels laid upon the ground, their planks shaped from oak. The longship was more than a vessel, it was a weapon. Its hull was shallow enough to glide up rivers, yet strong enough to cross open seas. Oars lined its sides, giving it speed even when the wind failed. The sail, made of wool dyed in stripes of red or brown, could carry it far and fast. At the prow, woodcarvers shaped dragons or serpents, snarling beasts meant to terrify enemies as the ship approached. To sit aboard such a ship, with the sea spray on one's face, and the rhythmic beat of oars in one's ears, was to feel untouchable, swift as a hawk, swooping down upon prey. In the 8th century, Europe was divided and uncertain. Charlemagne's empire was rising in the heart of the continent, but it had not yet reached its full height. England itself was not one kingdom but many: Northumbria, Mercia, Wessex, East Anglia, with its own rulers, its own rivalries, its own weaknesses. Borders shifted often, kings rose and fell, and alliances never lasted. To the Vikings, this patchwork of lands looked like a banquet table, each kingdom another dish to taste. The church was strong, but even there, cracks showed. Monasteries were wealthy, filled with treasures given by kings seeking blessings, yet they were poorly defended. Their walls were built for prayer, not war. Their inhabitants believed their sanctity was their shield, that God's favor would guard them against worldly threats. They were not wrong to believe this. It had been true for centuries, but in the year 793, that belief was tested and found wanting, and so the stage was set. On one side, quiet men with quills and candles, their eyes fixed on eternity, their days measured in prayer. On the other, restless men with axes and spears, their eyes fixed on gold and fame, their days measured in raids and voyages. Between them stretched the grey sea, vast and open, waiting only for sails to cross it. When those sails appeared on the horizon of Lindisfarne, it was not only the clash of two groups of men, it was the clash of two worlds. For the monks, The sea had always been a boundary, something that kept them apart, that wrapped their island in a cloak of safety. For the Vikings, the sea was no barrier at all. It was a bridge, and across it they came. The attack was quick, brutal, and unforgettable. What the monks saw as the house of God, the raiders saw as an undefended treasure chest. They struck with precision, tearing down doors, cutting down men, seizing chalices and reliquaries. Some monks may have clutched manuscripts to their chests, believing their holy words would protect them. Others may have knelt in prayer as axes fell. It is said that survivors fled into the marshes, watching from a distance as smoke rose and screams echoed across the island. When the ships pulled away, laden with treasure and captives, Lindisfarne was left broken. The silence that followed must have felt heavier than the violence itself. Where there had once been prayer, there was now only absence. The monks who returned to rebuild would never forget that morning, and their writings, filled with grief and trembling, would shape how the world remembered it. Europe reeled. Too many, it seemed as though the end of days had begun. How could pagans, godless men from the far north, strike so deep at the heart of Christendom? Some called it punishment for sins, others a warning from heaven. In truth, it was something simpler and more terrifying. It was hunger, it was ambition, it was the first ripple of an age that would wash across the continent for centuries to come. The raid on Lindisfarne was not the first Viking attack, but it was the one that Europe could not forget. It was the day the old rhythm of safety ended, and the long rhythm of fear began. From then on, every coastline, every monastery, every town near the sea would live with the knowledge that the horizon could bring death. And it all began with sails that appeared one quiet morning, with dragon-headed ships, with men whose names we do not know, but whose shadow still lingers. In the long shadow of Ragnar Lothbrok, one of his sons emerged as perhaps the most feared of all. Ivar the Boneless, born to a father whose name struck terror across kingdoms. Ivar was different from most men of his time. He was said to be unable to walk, a cripple from birth, yet his mind was sharp, cunning, and unyielding. Where others relied on strength, Ivar relied on strategy, on cruelty, and on the terrifying clarity of his intellect. Even in a world where physical prowess often defined a warrior, he carved his place through sheer brilliance and ruthless determination. The sagas tell that Ivar's birth frightened his mother, for she believed that a son, unable to walk, would bring shame or misfortune. But Ragnar, or the man we call Ragnar, is said to have seen something different in him, a mind that could conquer kingdoms even without the use of legs. And so Ivar was raised, nourished with care, trained in the ways of command, taught to wield not a sword in battle but the far more dangerous weapon of planning. He learned to sit upon a chariot or shield, carried into battle if need be, and there he observed, he commanded, he inspired fear. Ivar's cruelty was legendary. Stories speak of him treating prisoners with merciless precision, punishing entire towns to send a message, and making examples of those who dared oppose him. Unlike many Vikings who relied solely on the strength of their arms, Ivar's genius was in the way he could manipulate fear. He understood that terror could travel faster than armies, that a single act of brutality could ripple across a kingdom, breaking spirits before a sword ever touched the ground. Perhaps his most famous campaign was the invasion of England by the great heathen army. Following the death of Ragnar, Ivar gathered warriors from across Scandinavia, thousands of men, a host unlike any seen before in the British Isles. They landed in East Anglia and marched inexorably across the countryside. Town after town fell before them, some surrendering to pay tribute, others destroyed utterly. For the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, Ivar and his brothers were not merely raiders, they were an unstoppable force that bent the land to their will. Ivar's tactics were as inventive as they were brutal. He is said to have used his disability as a weapon, commanding from the center of his army while soldiers carried him atop a shield or a chariot, making him seem larger, more imposing than any normal man. His enemies, seeing this crippled figure, could not understand how he could orchestrate campaigns that left entire kingdoms trembling. It was as if the strength of his mind outweighed the weakness of his body, and in that contradiction lay his terror. The tales of Ivar's cruelty often verge into the grotesque, but they were part of a strategy designed to inspire dread. He demanded absolute obedience, punishing disloyal followers and foes alike. Kings who refused his demands were executed, and his methods of punishment became notorious. Some accounts describe him as using the environment itself to his advantage. such as forcing enemies into marshes where they would sink and drown, or setting towns ablaze and leaving captives to perish in the smoke. It was a calculated horror, a way of bending the world to his will without needing to fight every battle himself. Ivar's influence extended beyond mere terror. He reshaped the way the Vikings waged war. Under his leadership, raids were coordinated with precision. Villages were struck simultaneously, supply lines were disrupted, and intelligence was gathered in advance, giving the great heathen army an almost unstoppable edge. It was not merely the physical force of swords and axes, but the intellectual force of planning, strategy, and relentless calculation that made Ivar so formidable. And yet, behind the tales of cruelty and genius, there is a human element that often gets lost. A man born into weakness in a world that valued strength might have been despised or pitied, but Ivar transformed his limitation into power. Every siege, every battle, every act of terror was also a statement of self-definition. He would not be underestimated. He would not be ignored. He would command fear as effectively as any sword. Ivar's life, like the life of his father, blurs the line between myth and history. Chronicles of the Anglo-Saxons mention a king who led devastating raids, a man who could not walk, yet whose presence caused armies to tremble. The sagas embellish these accounts, filling them with episodes of cunning and cruelty that make him almost supernatural in reputation. To contemporaries, he was an enigma, a cripple who could conquer, a man whose mind ruled where his body could not. The legacy of Ivar, the Boneless, is inseparable from the terror he inspired. Kingdoms fell before him, rulers bent to his will, and the stories of his ingenuity and cruelty endured long after his death. He did not merely raid for gold or glory. He reshaped the very perception of Viking power. He showed that even the most unlikely figure, one limited in body but limitless in mind, could leave a mark so deep that it would echo across centuries. For England, his name became synonymous with dread. For Scandinavia, he became a symbol of what cunning and ruthlessness could achieve. And for us, looking back from 1,000 years later, Ivar the Boneless is a reminder that history remembers not only the strongest or the most numerous, but also the most terrifying and the most ingenious. He was a man who conquered kingdoms without walking, who wielded fear like a sword, and who carved his place in the Viking Age forever. Among the many sons and descendants of legendary Viking families, one stands out for the fear he inspired and the fury he carried wherever he went. Eric Bloodaxe, whose very name seems to spill from the lips with a promise of violence, was a man whose temper was as swift and deadly as the axe he wielded. Born into the turbulent world of 9th and 10th century Norway, he grew up in a land where kingship was never secure and the struggle for power was constant. In such a world, brutality was often as effective as skill, and Eric learned early that fear could be as powerful as loyalty. From a young age, Eric demonstrated both ambition and ruthlessness. He fought against his own family to claim what he believed was rightfully his, not out of whim. But because the rules of succession in Viking lands were fluid and often bloody, strength, cunning, and a willingness to strike first and strike hard defined the path to power, and Eric embraced all three. His opponents, even those related to him by blood, learned quickly that he would show no mercy, that compromise was weakness, and that hesitation could be fatal. Eric earned his moniker Bloodaxe in battles both small and large. He did not need a vast army to carve a reputation. His presence on the battlefield alone was enough to terrify foes. The sagas recount raids where his fury burned brighter than any fire he set to villages, where his sword cut through opposition with a swiftness that left survivors stunned. It was said that he took joy not merely in victory, but in the very act of striking fear, in asserting dominance so completely that any who looked upon him would tremble. Unlike some of the Vikings who preferred swift coastal raids, Eric sought kingship and authority. He became king of Norway, though his reign was never secure, and he later ruled in Northumbria, where he was as much a figure of terror as he was of power. His rule in England was marked by constant struggle, battles to assert control, and relentless enforcement of his will. Where others might have negotiated, Eric struck decisively, leaving no room for dissent. His enemies called him Bloodaxe, not only because of his violence in battle, but because of the many lives he claimed in his quest for dominance. Yet there was method behind his rage. Eric understood that fear was a tool. He used it to control allies as well as enemies. knowing that a reputation for violence could secure loyalty as effectively as oaths or gifts. Towns that had heard of him would sometimes surrender without a fight, knowing that resistance was hopeless. In this way, he expanded his influence not only through combat but through the careful cultivation of terror, letting the memory of his deeds precede him across the lands he sought to rule. Eric Bloodaxe's life was never peaceful, and his death was a fitting reflection of the turbulent times he lived in. Betrayal was as common as loyalty, and alliances could shift overnight. In Northumbria, he met his end at the hands of those who had once been his supporters, a reminder that in the Viking world, power was never secure. Even in death, however, his reputation endured. Tales of his ferocity, his cunning, and his rage circulated long after his body was gone, ensuring that Eric Bloodaxe remained, in legend and memory, a figure of dread. For listeners looking back from centuries later, Eric Bloodaxe is a symbol of the unrelenting violence and ambition of the Viking Age. He was not merely a warrior, he was a king whose temperament shaped the lands he touched, a man who understood that the heart of power was fear, and that authority demanded more than strength alone. His life reminds us that the Viking world was not only about raiding and sailing, but about the ruthless, assertion of control, the personal temperaments that could shape kingdoms, and the stories that survive long after the men themselves have passed. Eric's legacy is intertwined with the tales of Ragnar and Ivar, a continuation of the brutal brilliance of their line, where Ragnar inspired his sons to vengeance and conquest, and Ivar used cunning and strategy to bend kingdoms to his will. Eric lived the raw, unbridled fury of ambition, showing the world how terror and rage could define a ruler as much as armies or ships. He is remembered not only in chronicles and sagas, but in the very idea of the Viking king, fierce, unrelenting, and unforgettable. In the rugged fjords and steep valleys of Norway, long before kingship became a matter of formal coronation, one man rose above all others to unify the fractured lands. Harald Fairhair, known to some as Harald Hårfagre, was a prince whose ambition knew no bounds, and whose determination reshaped the very map of Scandinavia. Born into a landscape of small chieftains, each ruling over a handful of villages or a single valley, Harald grew up in a world where might and reputation were everything, where disputes over land, inheritance, and honor could erupt into bloodshed at any hour. From the start, Harald understood that to rule, he would need more than courage, he would need vision. The sagas tell that as a young man he made a vow not to cut or comb his hair until he had become the sole ruler of Norway, a symbolic gesture of determination that would become part of his legend. In his youth, he gathered allies, forged marriages, and learned the art of war from the chieftains and warriors of his homeland. He became known not only for his skill in battle, but for the way he could inspire loyalty, manipulate rivalries, and bend the stubborn chieftains to his will. The wars Harald waged to unify Norway were brutal. He marched across valleys and fjords, confronting one chieftain after another. Some submitted willingly, persuaded by his reputation and promises. Others resisted, only to face devastating consequences. Battles were fought not only with swords and axes, but with terror as a tool of governance. Towns that refused to acknowledge his authority could be burned. Villages that opposed him risked slaughter. Harald understood that fear could cement loyalty as much as oaths or gifts, and he wielded it with the precision of a seasoned general. Yet Harald was not merely a man of violence. He was also a strategist, carefully choosing when to fight and when to negotiate. Knowing that Norway's rugged terrain could make prolonged campaigns costly and unpredictable, he consolidated his rule by marrying into powerful families, absorbing rival lineages into his own, and ensuring that those who had opposed him could be brought into his fold or destroyed completely. His reign was a mixture of diplomacy and terror, an unrelenting drive to forge a fragmented land into a kingdom. The consolidation of Norway under Harald Fairhair did not come without cost. Many fled his wrath, leaving their homes and crossing the seas in search of safety. It is said that some of these exiles became the first settlers of Iceland and the Shetland Islands, carrying with them the knowledge of Harald's power and the memory of his relentless campaigns. In this way, the fear he inspired spread far beyond the borders of Norway, shaping the settlement patterns of the North Atlantic for generations. Harald's legacy is profound because he was more than a conqueror. He was a symbol of central authority in a world where power had previously been local and personal. By uniting Norway under a single crown, he created a kingdom that would endure, even as the Vikings continued their raids across Europe. His story is a reminder that terror can be an instrument of governance, that ambition can reshape geography, and that a ruler's reputation can travel faster than armies or ships. To the people of his time, Harold Fairhair was a figure of awe and fear. His enemies whispered his name with caution. His allies respected his cunning and his decisiveness. Even today, his legend lives on, entwined with the saga of the Viking Age. He was not merely a king. He was the first to impose order upon chaos, the man who made the fragmented Norwegian valleys bend to a single will, and the one whose ambition and ruthlessness set a model for the generations of Viking rulers who followed. For listeners drifting through this story, Harold's life reminds us that the Viking Age was not only about raiding and plunder, but also about the consolidation of power, the strategic use of fear, and the human drive to dominate a landscape both beautiful and unforgiving. He was a man whose ambition reshaped a nation, whose determination inspired both loyalty and terror, and whose legacy would echo through centuries of history. The world in which Sweyn Forkbeard came to power was one of constant motion, a turbulent stage of shifting alliances, fragile kingdoms, and the ceaseless roar of the sea. Born into the royal family of Denmark around the mid-10th century, Sweyn was heir to a legacy of ambition and violence. His father, Harold Bluetooth, had carved a kingdom from a patchwork of chieftains, forging the bonds of loyalty through both diplomacy and threat. Denmark under Harold was already a formidable power, but Sweyn from a young age showed that he would not be content to inherit a kingdom merely intact. He sought to expand it, to dominate, and to bend his neighbors to his will. From childhood, Sweyn learned that power in the Viking world demanded a careful balance of cunning, strength, and ruthlessness. He watched his father command armies, negotiate treaties, and suppress rebellion. He listened to the stories of great raiders and kings, men like Ragnar Lothbrok and Eric Bloodaxe, whose names carried terror across lands. And he observed the weaknesses of the neighboring kingdoms of England, where kings sat upon thrones that could be overturned by a single incursion, where noblemen squabbled over lands and loyalties shifted like the tide. Sweyn absorbed these lessons, and, as he matured, he began to plan not just raids, but campaigns that would change the political map of Northern Europe. Sweyn's rise was marked by both ambition and violence. Early in his life, he turned against his father, challenging Harold Bluetooth for the kingship of Denmark. Whether motivated by personal ambition, a desire for control, or the impatience of youth, Sweyn's actions were decisive. He led armies into battle against his father, ultimately forcing Harold into exile. The sagas hint that Sweyn may have been merciless in his treatment of rivals, a man who did not hesitate to remove anyone who threatened his claim. His ruthlessness was tempered by intelligence. He understood when to fight, when to negotiate, and when to use fear as a tool. In this way, he consolidated power in Denmark, establishing himself as a king who ruled not merely through bloodlines, but through reputation. Once secure in Denmark, Sweyn's ambitions turned southward, toward England. The kingdoms of Wessex, Mercia, and Northumbria were fragmented and vulnerable, recovering from previous Viking incursions, but still rich in treasure and fertile lands. For a king like Sweyn, they represented opportunity, a chance to extend his influence, claim tribute, and create a legacy greater than any that had come before him. His first incursions were raids along the coast, typical of Viking strategy, striking quickly at towns, monasteries, and settlements, plundering wealth, and disappearing before local forces could organize. These attacks were both tactical and symbolic, demonstrating his ability to strike where the Anglo-Saxons felt themselves most secure. Sweyn was not content with simple raids. Over time, he orchestrated a campaign of conquest, gathering a formidable fleet and an army of warriors loyal to him personally, rather than to a local chieftain. His invasions of England were relentless, combining the speed and surprise of longships with the calculated application of force. Towns fell not only to swords and axes, but also to terror, as stories spread of Sweyn's cruelty and efficiency. Villages that resisted were often destroyed completely, their inhabitants killed or enslaved, leaving a warning to others. Tribute payments became an acknowledgement of his supremacy, a means of avoiding destruction, and a testament to his growing power. Perhaps most striking about Sweyn Forkbeard was the way he balanced fear and diplomacy. He could strike with devastating force, yet he also negotiated when it served his purposes. Kings and nobles learned that while resistance could be fatal, submission could be profitable. Sweyn's ability to wield both sword and word made him exceptionally dangerous. He created an image of a king who was both unstoppable and calculating, a man whose presence in a region could bring ruin or protection, depending on how he was approached. By the turn of the millennium, Sweyn's power had expanded beyond Denmark. He had made himself a formidable threat in England, repeatedly raiding and extracting tribute. His reputation preceded him, carried in tales of villages burned, monasteries plundered, and kings humbled. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle records the fear and disruption his campaigns caused, describing England as a land under constant threat, its rulers forced to negotiate with a man whose ambitions seemed limitless. In 1013, Sweyn's years of planning and raiding culminated in a remarkable achievement. He declared himself King of England. Through a combination of military might, strategic alliances, and the relentless pressure of fear, he forced Thellard the Unready to flee, leaving Sweyn to rule not just Denmark, but also the richest and most coveted lands of England. His coronation, though not recorded with lavish detail, symbolized a moment when a Viking king had transcended his northern homelands to dominate a foreign kingdom. For a century, the English had endured raids and plunder, but under Sweyn, they faced a ruler who combined the fury of a Viking with the authority of a king. Sweyn's reign, however, was brief. He ruled England only a few weeks before dying in early 1014, leaving the kingdom in a precarious state. Yet even in death, his impact was profound. The fear he had cultivated did not dissipate. It was inherited by his son Canute the Great, who would go on to consolidate and expand the Viking influence over England, Denmark, and beyond. Sweyn had set the stage for an era in which Viking kings could rule not only through raids but through governance, weaving terror and power into a new model of rulership. Beyond the political and military achievements, Sweyn Forkbeard's story reminds us of the human dimensions of the Viking Age. He was ambitious, yes, and ruthless, but he was also intelligent, strategic, and aware of the power of reputation. His life demonstrates how fear could be weaponized, how a single determined ruler could alter the course of kingdoms, and how ambition could reshape the political geography of an entire continent. To contemporaries, he was a man to be feared and respected. To posterity, he remains a figure of awe, the archetype of the Viking king whose influence stretched far beyond his homelands. Sweyn's campaigns also show the interplay of violence, economics, and diplomacy. Tribute payments extracted from towns and kingdoms were not mere plunder. They were recognition of power, a currency of fear. The destruction he caused was calculated to maximize effect, and every raid carried a message: resist, and you perish. Comply, and your wealth may be spared. In this, he exemplified a key aspect of Viking strategy that set them apart from earlier raiders' long-term planning: psychological warfare and the deliberate shaping of both memory and perception. For England, Sweyn Forkbeard was a turning point. The Anglo-Saxon kingdoms had faced Viking raids for generations, but he represented a new phase, a Viking king who ruled, not temporarily or opportunistically, but as a sovereign whose authority was recognized and feared. The political landscape shifted, forcing English kings to adapt, defend, and negotiate in ways they had not previously considered. In many ways, Sweyn's campaigns prefigured the later consolidation of Viking rule under his son, Canute, and laid the foundations for a northern hegemony that would stretch across seas and kingdoms. Even today, looking back at Sweyn Forkbeard, we can sense the human drama behind the history. He was a man who sought power relentlessly, who learned from his father, exploited the weaknesses of his enemies, and combined violence, strategy, and diplomacy into an almost unstoppable force. He was feared for his cruelty, respected for his intelligence, and remembered for the sheer magnitude of his ambition. In the annals of Viking history, Sweyn stands as a reminder that conquest was never only about swords and ships, but about vision, cunning, and the ability to project power across both land and sea. In the end, Sweyn Forkbeard was more than a king. He was a symbol of the Viking Age itself. He represented the fusion of terror and authority, the expansion of Scandinavian influence into the heart of Europe, and the emergence of rulers who could command respect and obedience across multiple kingdoms. His story teaches us that history is shaped not only by battles won or lost, but by the strategic minds behind them, by ambition that refuses to be contained, and by the legacy of fear and respect that outlives even the briefest of reigns. Sweyn Forkbeard's life, his campaigns, and his death are a testament to the turbulent, ambitious, and often terrifying world of the Viking kings, a world where a single man could bend nations to his will and etch his name into history forever. When Sweyn Forkbeard died after claiming the throne of England, his son Canute inherited not only a kingdom but a world in turmoil. Born in the late 10th century, Canute grew up in the shadow of his father's ambition and ruthlessness, learning the lessons of both conquest and governance. He observed the fragile alliances, the shifting loyalties, and the constant threat posed by rival claimants to power. From a young age, he understood that being a Viking king was not merely about leading raids or striking fear into opponents. It was about strategy, diplomacy, and the ability to command loyalty across vast and diverse lands. Sienut's rise was gradual, a blend of patience, planning, and calculated violence. After Sweyn's death, he did not rush blindly into England. Instead, he gathered his forces in Denmark, consolidating support among chieftains and warriors who would be loyal to him personally. He strengthened his fleet, refined his strategies, and waited for the right moment to strike. This patience set him apart from many other Viking leaders whose ambitions often outpaced their capacity to hold power. Canute combined the ferocity of a raider with the prudence of a statesman, a combination that would define his reign. In 1015, Canute crossed the North Sea with a fleet that dwarfed anything England had previously faced. His arrival was not sudden chaos, but a calculated display of power. He landed in East Anglia, where local rulers had already heard of his father's conquests and feared his name. Canute did not simply rely on the shock of his arrival. He coordinated campaigns across multiple fronts, attacking towns, fortresses, and strategic positions in a systematic way. Each movement of his army was precise, ensuring that English forces could not regroup or mount a coordinated defense. The great heathen army, once the terror of Ivar the Boneless, had its spiritual successor in Canute, who combined discipline with the traditional unpredictability of Viking warfare. Sienut's campaigns were marked by both brutality and cunning. Villages that resisted were sometimes destroyed entirely, their inhabitants killed, enslaved, or dispersed. Towns that submitted might be spared, but required tribute and acknowledgement of Sienut's authority. His reputation for ruthlessness preceded him, and the psychological effect of his campaigns often accomplished more than battle itself. Kings and nobles learned that defiance could bring death or ruin, while obedience could secure survival. Canute understood that fear, once cultivated, was a currency as powerful as gold. But Sienut's genius was not solely in terror, it was in governance. As he gained control over England, he integrated himself into existing structures of power. He worked with local nobles, respected ecclesiastical authority, and maintained trade routes that benefited his kingdom. In this way, he transformed the Viking image from that of a raider who merely plundered, into a ruler who could hold lands and inspire loyalty. His administration combined Scandinavian sensibilities with English traditions, creating a hybrid rule that allowed for both stability and authority. Canute did not stop at England. He extended his influence back to Denmark, consolidating his rule over his father's kingdom, and eventually brought Norway under his control. By the early 1020s, he ruled 3 kingdoms: Denmark, Norway, and England, a feat almost unparalleled in the Viking era. The logistics of controlling such a vast territory required careful planning, trusted subordinates, and regular displays of power. Canute moved strategically between his kingdoms, ensuring that his presence was felt and that no region felt neglected or Sienut's reign was also shaped by his relationship with the church. Unlike some Viking rulers who had raided monasteries and defied Christian institutions, Canute understood the value of ecclesiastical support. He made alliances with influential bishops, supported churches and monasteries, and framed his rule as divinely sanctioned. In doing so, he gained not only legitimacy, but also a network of allies who could help administer his vast empire. This clever integration of spiritual authority and secular power allowed Canute to secure his position in a way that few Viking kings had managed before him. Despite his power, Sienut's reign was not without challenges. England remained divided in loyalties, with pockets of resistance requiring occasional campaigns and displays of force. Rival claimants in Norway and Denmark occasionally tested his authority, yet he met each challenge with a combination of military skill, strategic alliances, and calculated diplomacy. Where many rulers relied solely on violence or charisma, Canute relied on both. understanding that a kingdom was held not just by fear, but by respect and recognition of power. The stories of Canute the Great often focus on his wisdom, as much as his ruthlessness. Legends recount how he demonstrated humility and awareness of the limits of his power, famously attempting to command the tides as a lesson in human limitation. Whether entirely true or embellished by chroniclers, these tales underscore a key aspect of Canute's rule: a mind capable of foresight, reflection, and understanding, traits rare in a world dominated by raw strength. He was both a Viking warrior and a thoughtful king, a combination that allowed him to achieve a stability rarely seen among his predecessors. Under Canute, England experienced relative peace compared to the decades of chaos that had preceded his reign. Trade flourished, taxes were collected systematically, and laws were enforced consistently. Canute ensured that the Viking influence did not merely devastate lands, but became embedded in governance and culture. His fleet remained a deterrent to external threats, while his administration kept the kingdom cohesive. In Denmark and Norway, he maintained a similar balance of power, alternating between displays of force and careful diplomacy to maintain loyalty among chieftains and nobles. Canute's personal life also reflected his political acumen. He married strategically, forging alliances through marriage that strengthened his rule and integrated rival families into his sphere of influence. His children, particularly Harold Harefoot and Harthacnot, would inherit portions of his empire, continuing the legacy of Viking kingship that combined conquest with governance. Canute understood that power was not merely temporary, and he worked to establish a dynasty that could endure beyond his own lifetime. In the end, Canute the Great stands as a testament to the evolution of Viking kingship. From the early days of violent raids and unpredictable attacks, he transformed the image of the Viking ruler into one capable of holding kingdoms, integrating different cultures, and governing over vast territories with both authority and wisdom. He combined the ruthless efficiency of a raider with the patience and foresight of a statesman, creating an empire that endured long after his death. For those listening from 1,000 years later, Canute's story demonstrates the full spectrum of Viking power, from the terror of the raids that devastated monasteries and villages, to the calculated authority of a king who ruled 3 kingdoms. He was a man who understood fear, ambition, and governance in equal measure, and who used all 3 to reshape Northern Europe. His life reminds us that history is not only written in the clash of swords, but in strategy, diplomacy, and the quiet moments in which power is consolidated and extended. Canute the Great's reign left a lasting imprint on both the lands he ruled and the perception of Viking power in history. Unlike many of his predecessors, who inspired fear and destruction without establishing lasting governance, Canute achieved both. He was feared, respected, and remembered as a king who could dominate not only through violence, but through foresight, cunning, and the ability to wield authority across cultures, seas, and generations. The legacy of Canute the Great, the Viking king who ruled 3 kingdoms, is one of ambition tempered by strategy, of conquest refined into governance, and of a man who transformed terror into lasting power. By the mid-11th century, the age of the Vikings, as unchallenged raiders and conquerors, was drawing to a close. Yet in Norway and beyond, one man embodied the last echoes of that era. Harald Sigurdsson, better known as Harald Hardrada, stands as the archetype of the Viking warrior king, whose life was shaped by exile, ambition, and relentless pursuit of glory. Born in 1015, Harald was the son of Sigurd Syr, a petty king in southeastern Norway, and he grew up in a land of fjords, forests, and mountains where loyalty was earned through strength, courage, and cunning. From childhood, Harald was immersed in the traditions of the Vikings, the sagas of great warriors, the skill of swordsmanship, and the knowledge that survival and success required both boldness and intellect. Harald's early life was marked by upheaval. Norway in the 11th century was a patchwork of petty kingdoms, often at odds with one another, and the death of King Olaf II forced Harald into exile. He fled to Kievan Rus, traveling along rivers and through forests, learning not only the art of warfare but also diplomacy, navigation, and survival in foreign lands. These formative years would shape him into a man capable of extraordinary resilience and adaptability. It was in the courts of Eastern Europe, amid the complex politics of Rus and Byzantium, that Harald honed the skills that would later define his reign: leadership, strategy, and the ability to command respect in even the most unfamiliar of circumstances. Eventually, Harold entered the service of the Byzantine Empire, joining the famed Varangian Guard in Constantinople. Here, far from his homeland, he distinguished himself as a warrior of exceptional skill. Battles against Saracens and other enemies of the empire tested him, and he learned the importance of discipline, organization, and loyalty. Unlike earlier Viking raiders, who relied on sudden strikes and brute force, Harold's experiences in Byzantium taught him the value of strategy, logistics, and the integration of different military traditions. He returned to Norway decades later, not as a mere warrior, but as a seasoned commander, prepared to seize the throne with both strength and cunning. Harald Hardrada eventually claimed the kingship of Norway in 1046, following a period of negotiations, alliances, and warfare that brought together a kingdom previously fragmented by competing chieftains. His reign in Norway was marked by both consolidation and expansion. He reformed administration, strengthened defenses, and maintained a powerful fleet, ensuring that his rule was not only secure on land, but projected across the seas. At the same time, Harold cultivated the reputation of a fearsome warrior king, combining the terror of raids with the authority of kingship. His image was one of relentless power, a man whose sword and mind together commanded loyalty and respect. Yet Harold's ambitions extended beyond Norway. Like his Viking predecessors, he looked toward England, where dynastic disputes created opportunities for foreign intervention. In 1066, he launched an invasion of England, claiming the throne in the wake of Edward the Confessor's death. Harold's army crossed the North Sea with precision, landing in northern England and moving south with determination. The scale of his campaign was immense, reflecting both his military experience and his understanding of psychological warfare. Towns and villages learned quickly that resistance was dangerous, while surrender offered the chance to preserve life and property under his authority. The climax of Harold's campaign came at the Battle of Stamford Bridge, where his forces confronted those of King Harold Godwinson. Harold's troops, veterans of decades of warfare across Europe and Byzantium, fought with discipline and ferocity, yet the battle proved fateful. Despite their skill, Harold and much of his army were overwhelmed. The sagas describe his death with vivid solemnity. Struck down by a lone English soldier, the king's life ended on foreign soil, far from the fjords of his youth. Yet, even in death, Harald Hardrada embodied the terror and ambition of the Viking Age, leaving behind a legacy that would endure in both fear and admiration. Harold's life is remarkable not only for its military achievements, but also for the scope of his experience. He was a man who traveled across Europe, fought in foreign lands, and adapted lessons from multiple cultures to enhance his power. His reign demonstrates the evolution of Viking kingship, from simple raiding to complex administration, from localized terror to strategic conquest. He understood that to command respect, a king needed not only a sword, but also wisdom, foresight, and the ability to integrate the lessons of diverse lands and peoples. The story of Harald Hardrada also reflects the human dimension of the Viking Age. He was ambitious, yes, and often ruthless, but he was also capable of patience, diplomacy, and learning. His life shows that the Viking kings who dominated Europe were not merely barbarians with axes. They were strategists, diplomats, and men who understood the intricate balance between fear and governance. Harold's campaigns from the rivers of Rus to the coasts of England illustrate a man whose vision spanned continents, whose skill in battle was matched by his intelligence, and whose ambition sought to revive the glory of an era that was slowly fading. Even today, Harald Hardrada stands as a symbol of the last great Viking king. His death at Stamford Bridge is often seen as the end of the Viking Age, yet his influence endured. The terror he inspired, the strategies he employed, and the kingdoms he ruled left an indelible mark on history. He reminds us that the Viking kings were more than raiders. They were visionaries who combined violence, strategy, and political acumen in ways that reshaped Northern Europe. Harald Hardrada's life, adventures, and death form the final chapter in a long line of terrible and ambitious Viking rulers, a story of courage, ambition, and the inexorable passage of history itself. For those listening, it is easy to imagine Harold standing upon the deck of a longship to the north, sea wind in his hair, eyes fixed upon the distant shore, plotting conquest with the calm ruthlessness of a man who has lived through exile, war, and glory. He was the culmination of centuries of Viking tradition, carrying forward the legacy of Ragnar, Ivar, Eric, Harold Fairhair, and Sweyn. And in that moment, before the storm of battle at Stamford Bridge, he embodied the final, terrifying brilliance of the Viking kings, a figure whose legend would echo long after the age of raiders had passed. The death of Canute the Great in 1035 left a vacuum that no single figure could fully fill. His empire, stretched across Denmark, Norway, and England, had been held together not just by military might, but by a combination of diplomacy, fear, and the personal authority of a king who had spent decades consolidating power. With Canute gone, the delicate balance he had maintained began to unravel almost immediately. His sons, Harold Harefoot in England and Harthacnut in Denmark, inherited not a cohesive empire, but a patchwork of loyalties, rivalries, and unresolved tensions. The unity that had defined Sianut's reign quickly gave way to fragmentation, marking a turning point in the history of Viking dominance. Harold Harefoot assumed control of England, ruling as a cautious but determined king. His reign was marked by a mixture of political maneuvering, sporadic conflict, and efforts to assert his authority over the Anglo-Saxon nobility. Harold's rule was challenged by those who remained loyal to Harthacnut, creating a sense of constant tension. England, which under Canute had enjoyed relative stability despite the scars of Viking raids, now experienced uncertainty. Nobles shifted allegiances according to opportunity, and the memory of Canute's decisive rule made both Harold and Harthacnut aware that their authority depended on more than inheritance. It required constant demonstration of strength and strategic acumen. Harthacnut, meanwhile, governed Denmark, his focus split between consolidating support at home and asserting influence over England. The brothers' rivalries meant that both kingdoms faced intermittent instability, with skirmishes, rebellions, and disputes over succession shaping the political landscape. Unlike their father, neither Harold nor Harthacnut possessed the combination of fear and respect that had allowed Canute to command three kingdoms simultaneously. Each son relied heavily on loyalists and advisors, whose ambitions often complicated governance and threatened to destabilize the fragile order. The fracturing of power extended beyond the borders of the brothers' realms. Norway, too, experienced shifts in leadership and challenges to authority. Harald Hardrada, who would later become one of the last great Viking kings, was still a young man during this period, and the turbulence in Denmark and England created opportunities for ambitious rulers to seek advantage. The once tightly controlled empire that Canute had established began to resemble the fragmented patchwork of chieftains and regional lords that had existed before his rise. Centralized power, a hallmark of Sianut's reign, gave way to localized struggles, highlighting the difficulty of maintaining a unified Viking realm without a leader of extraordinary ability. This period also marked a subtle shift in Viking strategy and identity. The raids and conquests that had defined earlier generations of kings and warlords became increasingly intertwined with governance. Kings like Harold Harefoot and Harthacnut were as concerned with taxes, administration, and alliances as they were with military campaigns. The blending of raiding tradition with bureaucratic necessity reflected the evolution of Viking power. Conquest alone was no longer enough to sustain authority. Leaders had to navigate complex social and political networks, balancing fear with respect, violence with diplomacy, and ambition with pragmatism. For the people living under the rule of Sianut's sons, life was a mixture of continuity and uncertainty. Many towns continued to pay tribute and recognize the authority of the Viking kings, but the absence of Sianut's commanding presence left room for rebellion and dissent. Villages that had prospered under his stable administration now faced the risk of sudden shifts in loyalty, punitive measures, or neglect. Merchants and farmers alike were aware that their survival depended on adaptability, understanding the changing loyalties of the nobility, and navigating the capricious demands of rulers who had inherited power rather than earned it. The broader political landscape of Northern Europe during this time was equally volatile. Neighboring kingdoms watched the fracturing Viking Empire with keen interest. Anglo-Saxon rulers, continental European princes, and Scandinavian chieftains all recognized that the death of Canute the Great presented opportunities for expansion, negotiation, and reclamation of lost territory. Alliances were forged and broken in rapid succession, and the specter of Viking raids continued to loom over both England and Denmark. Even as the nature of Viking power shifted from relentless aggression to administrative control, Canute's sons also faced the challenge of maintaining the legacy of terror and respect that had made their father's name feared across kingdoms. Where Canute had combined military prowess with strategic governance, Harold and Harthacnut often relied more heavily on reputation and advisors, leaving gaps that opportunistic nobles and foreign powers sought to exploit. These gaps undermined centralized authority, demonstrating the delicate balance required to sustain an empire built through both conquest and careful administration. Despite these challenges, the period following Sianut's death was not entirely chaotic. Certain regions remained relatively stable, governed by capable nobles who upheld systems of taxation, law, and defense established during his reign. Trade continued along the North Sea, and cultural exchanges between England and Scandinavia persisted, reflecting the enduring influence of Viking integration into European society. Yet the underlying fragility of this arrangement meant that any significant challenge rebellion, foreign invasion, or internal rivalry could quickly destabilize the realm. This era also illustrates a broader historical truth. Empires, no matter how formidable under a single leader, often fracture when succession is contested or poorly managed. Sianut's sons inherited a world shaped by decades of conquest, diplomacy, and terror, but they lacked the unifying vision and personal authority that had allowed him to command loyalty across multiple kingdoms. Their reigns serve as a reminder that power is as much about perception and presence as it is about armies and fortresses, and that the legacies of even the most fearsome rulers are vulnerable to the passage of time and the ambitions of successors. For historians and storytellers, the period of Harold Harefoot and Harthacnut offers a fascinating study in the challenges of inherited power. It shows how quickly centralized authority can unravel, how regional loyalties can shift in response to perceived weakness, and how the reputation of a father, no matter how formidable, cannot guarantee the stability of his sons. The Viking legacy, so often associated with raids, battles, and terror, was now tested by the demands of governance, succession, and diplomacy, highlighting the evolution of leadership in a changing medieval world. In the end, the reigns of Sianut's sons marked a turning point in the Viking story. The era of unified Scandinavian authority over England, Denmark, and Norway was over, replaced by fragmentation, rivalries, and the slow decline of traditional Viking dominance. Yet the legacy of their father remained powerful. The kingdoms he had unified, the terror he had inspired, and the governance structures he had established continued to influence the political landscape of Northern Europe, even as power fractured the memory of Canute the Great, shaped the ambitions, strategies, and fears of his successors, reminding both rulers and subjects of the enduring impact of a king who had mastered the delicate balance between fear and authority. For listeners drifting through this story, it is easy to imagine the shifting loyalties of the time. Nobles watching the horizon for the next sign of power, villagers weighing obedience against survival, and kings striving to emulate the authority of a father whose shadow loomed over every decision. The era of Sianut's sons is a story of inherited ambition, fragile authority, and the challenges of maintaining Viking power in a changing world. A story that underscores the human complexities behind the terrifying and brilliant Viking kings who preceded them. After the deaths of the great Viking kings like Canute the Great and Harald Hardrada, the age of unified Scandinavian authority began to fade. Where once a single ruler could command vast fleets and entire kingdoms, power splintered into the hands of regional warlords, chieftains, and ambitious local kings. These men were often fierce warriors, shaped by decades of raiding, pillaging, and fighting for survival in a world where loyalty was temporary and betrayal could be fatal. Unlike the legendary figures who had ruled multiple kingdoms, these local warlords ruled over smaller territories, yet their impact on the communities they controlled was immediate and intense. Life under these regional rulers was defined by unpredictability. Villagers might pay tribute one year, only to be attacked the next if the chieftain's ambitions shifted or if alliances faltered. Local warlords were masters of both terror and opportunity. They struck with swift precision, sometimes raiding neighboring territories, sometimes negotiating tribute and loyalty in exchange for protection. Their power was rooted not in inheritance or legitimacy, but in their ability to project force and exploit fear. Communities learned quickly that survival depended on reading the temperaments of these rulers, understanding the alliances at play, and knowing when to submit and when to flee. The wars of these local leaders were as personal as they were political. Feuds could erupt over land, honor, or family ties, and vengeance often dictated action more than strategy. Warlords like Thorfinn Sigurdsson in Orkney, or the lesser-known kings of the Shetlands and Hebrides, carved out territories for themselves, using fleets of longships, not only to raid abroad but to control the coasts and rivers that provided both wealth and strategic advantage. These men were the inheritors of the Viking tradition of violence, yet their scope was narrower. Their ambitions often constrained by geography, local rivalries, and the lingering influence of more powerful neighbors. Despite their relative isolation, the actions of these warlords continued to shape the broader political landscape. They maintained the memory of Viking dominance across northern Europe and the British Isles. Monasteries, towns, and coastal settlements still lived under the shadow of their longships. Stories of their raids spread quickly, carried by word of mouth and rumor, ensuring that even small-scale rulers wielded influence far beyond the borders of their immediate territories. Their cruelty, like that of the great kings before them, was both a tool and a legacy, a way to cement loyalty and demand obedience from those under their control. The rise of these regional powers also demonstrates the adaptability of Viking leadership. With the collapse of centralized authority, leaders who might have been minor figures in the era of Canute or Harald Hardrada could become dominant within their local context. Some of these warlords engaged in diplomacy, forging temporary alliances with neighbors, or even English or Scottish kings, while others relied solely on the sword and the intimidation it inspired. Their rule was a mixture of fear, negotiation, and opportunism, reflecting the ongoing tension between chaos and order in post-imperial Viking society. Communities under their rule experienced both protection and danger. Tribute could secure a measure of peace, yet rebellion or refusal could provoke swift retribution. Villagers became adept at navigating the shifting loyalties of local rulers, learning to read the signals of impending raids, and adapting their lives to the ebb and flow of Viking power. In this way, even the smallest warlords wielded significant influence over daily life, continuing the centuries-old tradition of Viking impact on the landscapes and people they dominated. By the late 11th century, these local leaders represented the final chapter of the Viking Age. They were heirs to the violence, cunning, and ambition of the great kings, yet they operated in a world increasingly constrained by emerging European monarchies, Christian influence, and organized defenses. The era of raiding and conquest was giving way to a more localized form of authority, where survival and control were measured in immediate, tangible terms rather than empire building across seas. Yet the legacy of these warlords, like the great kings who had come before them, remained vivid. Fear, respect, and the memory of the sea-borne power of the Vikings endured in legend, lore, and the very settlements they once terrorized. For listeners today, imagining the lives of these local warlords is to glimpse the human reality behind the sagas and chronicles. Men of ambition, skill, and ruthlessness, shaping their world with longships, axes, and cunning. Their stories may lack the grandeur of Canute or Harald Hardrada, yet they capture the essence of Viking power in its most intimate and immediate form, reminding us that history is often lived not only by kings and conquerors, but by the smaller figures whose ambitions ripple through the lives of everyone around them. Even as their influence waned over the centuries, these warlords preserved the memory of Viking dominance in the north. Coastal towns, islands, and river settlements bore the marks of their raids, fortifications, and tribute demands. Generations later, the stories of their ferocity, resourcefulness, and cunning would continue to echo in sagas and chronicles, linking them to the legacy of the great kings who had once ruled 3 kingdoms or crossed continents in pursuit of power. In this way, the local warlords of the post-Canute era stand as a testament to the enduring human drive for authority, survival, and recognition, even as the age of great Viking kings slowly receded into history. By the late 11th century, the Viking Age that had once struck fear across Europe was drawing to a close. The great kings and formidable warlords who had commanded fleets of longships and reshaped entire kingdoms were no longer the dominant forces on the continent. Yet the sea still carried the echoes of their power, as smaller groups of raiders and adventurers continued to strike at coastal towns, monasteries, and trade centers. These final raids were less about empire building and more about survival. plunder, and the continuation of a tradition that had defined a generation of Scandinavian warriors. The targets of these last Viking expeditions were often predictable: monasteries, rich in silver and gold, small villages along rivers, and towns lightly defended, compared to emerging fortified cities. The raiders moved swiftly, striking with the same precision and ferocity that had characterized their ancestors, but on a smaller scale. Longships cut through the cold northern waters, carrying men hardened by decades of conflict, and their arrival often sent panic through communities that had grown accustomed to occasional incursions, but remained vulnerable to sudden, devastating attacks. Fear was their constant companion, as it had always been, and it remained one of their most powerful weapons. These raids, however, were not always purely destructive. Some Viking groups engaged in trade, negotiation, and even settlement as they traveled, blending raiding with diplomacy and commerce. The lines between conqueror, trader, and settler blurred, reflecting the changing dynamics of Northern Europe. By this time, Christianity had become firmly established in many regions, and European monarchs had grown stronger, with armies, fortifications, and legal systems capable of resisting raiders more effectively than in previous centuries. Viking raiders increasingly faced the reality that the world they had dominated was no longer theirs to conquer unchallenged. Despite this, the spirit of the Vikings remained. Tales of daring coastal raids, cunning ambushes, and miraculous escapes persisted in the sagas, keeping alive the memory of an era defined by adventure and terror. These stories circulated across Europe, reminding communities that even as the old order faded, the seafaring warriors of the north could still appear with little warning, demanding tribute or exacting revenge for past grievances. It was a time of transition, a liminal moment between the age of raiding and the emergence of more centralized, powerful kingdoms capable of resisting external threats. The decline of Viking raids was also a reflection of internal change. Scandinavian societies were evolving, moving toward more structured governance, trade networks, and Christian institutions. The men who might once have sought fortune through plunder now found opportunities in administration, military service under local kings, or commerce. Those who continued raiding often did so on a smaller scale, forming localized bands rather than commanding entire fleets. This shift marked the end of the era in which a single Viking king could traverse continents, dictate terms to multiple kingdoms, and inspire terror through both reputation and force. Monasteries, once the most vulnerable and profitable targets, had fortified themselves. Coastal towns had built defenses and organized militias. Trade routes were monitored, and rulers learned from past experiences, reducing the opportunities for large-scale, devastating raids. Even as raiders struck, they often faced fierce resistance, and their exploits became riskier and less rewarding. The psychological impact that Vikings once wielded so effectively, fear that could topple kings and bend towns to their will, was gradually being diminished by preparation, coordination, and emerging authority structures across Europe. Yet for the Vikings themselves, these final raids were not only about plunder, they were a continuation of identity. To sail, to fight, and to demonstrate skill in battle was to live according to the ideals that had defined generations. Even in a changing world, these warriors sought to prove themselves, to maintain a connection to the legacies of Harold Fairhair, Sweyn Forkbard, Canute the Great, and Harold Hardrada. The thrill of navigation, the tension of approaching a distant shore, and the strategic calculations of attack and retreat remained central to their lives. A reminder that the Viking spirit was as much cultural as it was martial. By the early 12th century, organized Viking activity had largely ceased. The once dominant fleets that had terrorized the coasts of England, Ireland, France, and beyond were broken up, absorbed into local forces, or redirected toward other pursuits. Scandinavian kingdoms had stabilized, monarchs had strengthened their authority, and the societies of Northern Europe were increasingly integrated into the emerging medieval order. The age of unchallenged Viking kings and warlords was over, replaced by a new world in which raids were episodic rather than systemic, and in which diplomacy, trade, and governance increasingly defined power. Even as the era ended, the legacy of the Vikings endured in lasting ways. Coastal fortifications, fortified towns, and maritime trade routes all bore the imprint of centuries of seafaring conquest. The sagas, poems, and chronicles preserved the memory of kings and warlords, of raids and battles, of longships cutting through fog and waves, carrying men whose ambition and ruthlessness shaped the destiny of entire regions. For those living under their shadow, the memory of Viking terror remained vivid, even after the ships had stopped coming. For listeners today, imagining these last raids is to picture the twilight of a world defined by mobility, violence, and daring. The longships still appear in the imagination, cutting through northern waters, carrying men hardened by decades of fighting, seeking wealth, glory, or simply survival. It is a quiet, reflective end to an era of extraordinary ambition, cunning, and ferocity, a moment in which the echoes of Viking kings and local warlords fade, leaving only stories, scars, and the enduring impression of a people who once ruled the seas with unmatched skill and terror. The last Viking raids remind us that history is a process, not a single moment. What had seemed permanent in the days of Harald Hardrada or Canute the Great gradually transformed. As kingdoms stabilized, defenses improved, and societies evolved, the Vikings themselves adapted, integrated, or disappeared into the emerging medieval order. And yet, even in their decline, they left a mark that could not be erased. The long shadow of their ships across Europe, the memory of their ambition and brutality, and the stories that continue to captivate generations, inviting us to wander through fjords, coastal villages, and rivers, once raided, imagining the fear and awe inspired by the men of the north. Even as the Viking Age came to a close and the longships no longer cut through northern waters with the threat of sudden attack, the legacy of the Viking kings endured in ways far subtler than the immediate terror they had once inspired. Their influence persisted in the structure of governance, in legal systems, in the networks of trade and settlement, and in the stories that communities carried forward through generations. Kings like Canute the Great, Harald Hardrada, and even the lesser-known warlords had transformed not only the territories they ruled, but also the minds and expectations of those who lived under their authority. Their reigns demonstrated a blend of ruthlessness and strategy, violence and diplomacy, that left an indelible mark on the political and cultural landscape of Northern Europe. One of the clearest legacies was in governance. The administrative structures that Canute had implemented across England and Denmark, blending Scandinavian and Anglo-Saxon traditions, became a model for managing complex, multi-ethnic kingdoms. Local lords and nobles continued to collect tribute, enforce law, and maintain defenses along the lines established during his reign. Even as later rulers adjusted these systems, the fundamental idea that authority could be centralized and maintained through a combination of personal loyalty, taxation, and military presence endured. Communities accustomed to Viking rule found continuity in these structures, even after the threat of raids had faded, demonstrating the lasting practicality of governance introduced by these warrior kings. The legal influence of the Vikings also persisted. Across Scandinavia, the assembly-based systems known as things had been refined and expanded under the rule of powerful kings. These gatherings, where free men could voice grievances, adjudicate disputes, and enact laws, reflected both the egalitarian ideals of Viking society and the authority of the monarch who presided over them. In England, the integration of Scandinavian law with existing Anglo-Saxon systems during Canute's reign created a hybrid legal framework that influenced subsequent governance. The concept of law, as both a social contract and an instrument of royal authority, developed and enforced by the Vikings, provided a foundation for the more structured medieval legal systems that emerged in Northern Europe. Trade and settlement were additional arenas in which the Viking legacy endured. The longships that once carried raiders now enabled merchants, settlers, and explorers to move efficiently across seas and rivers. Former raiding routes evolved into trade networks, connecting Scandinavia with England, Ireland, France, and beyond. Cities and towns that had suffered attacks became centers of commerce and administration, often retaining Scandinavian place names, architectural influences, and cultural markers. These settlements served as living reminders of the Viking presence, blending the memory of conquest with practical, enduring contributions to regional development. Culturally, the impact of Viking kings remained vivid in stories, songs, and chronicles. Sagas and oral histories preserved the exploits of kings and warlords, keeping alive the memory of their ambition, cunning, and courage. These narratives shaped collective identity and imagination, portraying figures who could rule 3 kingdoms, survive exile, or defy the odds in battle. Even in Christianized Europe, where the Vikings were often depicted as heathen invaders, Their tales carried elements of admiration, cautionary lessons, and fascination, reflecting the complex ways in which societies integrated the memory of these rulers into their own evolving cultures. The architectural and geographic imprint of Viking rule also persisted. Fortified towns, strategic outposts, and coastal defenses built or improved under Viking kings remained in use for centuries. Bridges, roads, and trade centers facilitated both military control and economic growth, demonstrating the dual legacy of conquest and administration. In some regions, archaeological evidence of Viking settlements, burial practices, and material culture provided tangible links to the period of great kings and warlords, allowing future generations to trace the tangible footprint of an era that had reshaped Northern Europe. Even the Scandinavian kingdoms themselves bore the imprint of these rulers in their political evolution. The consolidation of Norway under Harald Hardrada, the administration of Denmark under Canute, and the expansion of influence into England established precedents for kingship that endured long after the era of Viking raids. The combination of military strength, diplomacy, and strategic governance demonstrated by these leaders influenced the development of medieval monarchy in Northern Europe, showing that authority could be maintained not solely through fear or inheritance, but through organized administration, alliances, and careful integration of conquered territories. For the people living under the shadow of these kings, the legacy was both practical and psychological. Laws guided daily life, markets and trade networks facilitated survival and prosperity, and stories of past rulers shaped expectations of justice, loyalty, and courage. Communities had internalized the lessons of Viking rule, that power could be both protective and destructive, that allegiance was valuable, and that the authority of a king was as much about perception and strategy as it was about force. These lessons persisted in the collective memory long after the ships had disappeared from the horizon. Even in modern times, the legacy of Viking kings resonates in language, law, and cultural memory. Place names, legal traditions, and historical narratives continue to reflect the influence of an era in which kings ruled through a blend of fear, diplomacy, and strategy. The sagas, now studied as literature and historical record, preserve the memory of their ambition and cunning, allowing contemporary audiences to appreciate the complexities of Viking leadership beyond the simplified image of raiders and barbarians. In this way, the legacy of Viking kings serves as a bridge between the violent, adventurous past and the structured, politically complex societies that followed. The story of Viking influence is thus not only one of terror and conquest, but also of adaptation, integration, and enduring impact. The cultural and political frameworks they established continued to shape governance, law, commerce, and societal norms, providing continuity in a world that had been repeatedly disrupted by raids and warfare. Their memory informed the aspirations and fears of subsequent rulers, embedding lessons of strategy, ruthlessness, and diplomacy into the fabric of medieval Europe. For those drifting through this tale tonight, it is possible to imagine the lingering presence of Viking kings in the rhythms of daily life. A tax collected according to the structure Canute had established. A legal dispute resolved in a thing as Harold had envisioned a marketplace shaped by trade routes, once secured by longships, and stories told of ships cutting through fog and waves. In these subtle, persistent ways, the Vikings remained influential long after their era of conquest ended, proving that power can endure in memory, in structure, and in culture, even when the longships have vanished from the seas. Even as the last of the great Viking kings and regional warlords passed from the stage of history, their presence persisted in the stories that people told, the sagas that were sung, and the myths that grew around their lives. The deeds of men like Canute the Great, Harald Hardrada, and the countless local rulers who had carved their territories out of fjords and rivers became more than history. They became legend. In the long halls of Norway, Denmark, and even in the monasteries and towns of England, tales of their ambition, cunning, and ferocity were passed down, first orally, then in writing, blending fact and imagination into narratives that shaped cultural memory. These legends were not simply about glorifying violence or conquest. They often carried lessons about loyalty, justice, ambition, and human limitation. The story of Canute commanding the tides, for example, survives not as a literal historical event, but as a powerful metaphor about the limits of power and the necessity of humility. Even for kings who ruled 3 kingdoms, Harald Hardrada's campaigns became epic sagas, emphasizing the skill, courage, and relentless drive that defined his life. Even local warlords who had once terrorized villages became characters in stories that celebrated their resourcefulness, cunning, or occasionally, their tragic downfall. The myth-making process allowed societies to preserve memory, understand the past, and interpret the influence of these rulers long after the fleets had disappeared from northern waters. In Scandinavia, the sagas recorded genealogies, feuds, and heroic deeds, creating a framework in which historical kings became larger-than-life figures. These stories served multiple purposes. They entertained, educated, and reinforced cultural values through tales of loyalty, betrayal, and the struggle for power. The Vikings' moral and social codes were transmitted across generations. Young listeners would imagine themselves on the decks of longships or in the halls of kings, witnessing the strategies, negotiations, and conflicts that had once shaped entire kingdoms. The blend of human ambition and extraordinary courage in these stories made them timeless, accessible to anyone willing to listen and imagine. In England and other regions affected by Viking rule, memory took a different but equally powerful form. Chronicles written by monks, clerics, and local scribes documented the raids, battles, and interactions between Vikings and Christian communities. While these accounts often emphasized the terror, destruction, and paganism of the invaders, they also recorded details of governance, treaties, and cultural exchange. Over time, these records contributed to a complex view of Viking kings, both feared and respected, brutal yet capable of diplomacy, destructive yet capable of leaving enduring institutions. These dualities allowed the memory of Viking rulers to persist, not only as a cautionary tale, but as a study of leadership and influence. The myths surrounding Viking kings were reinforced by their physical legacy on the landscape. Settlements, fortifications, and even burial mounds acted as tangible reminders of their presence. When people walked past a hilltop fort, a river crossing, or a coastal outpost, they were reminded that once these spaces had been the stage for the ambition and ruthlessness of men who commanded fleets and kingdoms. These remnants of Viking activity provided a physical anchor for the stories, ensuring that memory remained connected to place as well as narrative. Even in modern times, the memory of Viking kings continues to capture imagination. Literature, films, and historical studies draw on the sagas and chronicles, exploring the tension between ambition, cruelty, courage, and governance. The stories of Sienot's empire, Harald Hardrada's campaigns, and the localized warlords' cunning remain compelling because they reflect human traits: strategy, resilience, pride, and the desire for recognition that resonate across centuries. The myths allow listeners to step into a world where the line between history and legend blurs, where the fjords, rivers, and coasts of northern Europe are alive with the footsteps and sails of extraordinary men. For listeners today, imagining these legends is to feel the vastness of the Viking world. The chill wind over northern seas, the rhythmic creak of oars, the tension before a raid or a battle, and the weight of decisions that could decide life or death. The stories of Viking kings are not merely about the past. They are about understanding ambition, strategy, and the human desire for power and legacy. They show that even as the era of raids ended, the memory of these men continued to influence societies, shape cultural identity, and inspire generations to reflect on courage, cunning, and the complex nature of leadership. The sagas and myths also remind us that history is lived and remembered differently by each generation. Where chroniclers saw barbarians, poets saw heroes. Where townsfolk felt fear, storytellers found drama. And where kings sought control, later generations found narrative, moral lessons, and inspiration. In this way, the Viking kings live on, not only in the remnants of their conquests, but in the human imagination, preserved through words, song, and legend, ensuring that their shadow continues to stretch across centuries, even as the ships themselves have vanished from the horizon. As we reach the end of our journey through the lives of the most terrible Viking kings and warlords, it is worth pausing to reflect not only on the violence and ambition that defined their rule, but also on the human dimensions behind the legends. These were men shaped by a world of fjords, forests, and rivers, where survival demanded courage, cunning, and at times, ruthlessness. From Canute the Great, who ruled 3 kingdoms with calculated authority, to Harold Hardrada, whose life was a saga of exile, battle, and ambition, to the local warlords who terrorized or protected their small territories. The Viking kings left a complex legacy that blends fear, admiration, and enduring influence. Their lives illustrate the delicate balance between ambition and strategy, strength and diplomacy, terror and governance, revealing that the power they wielded was never simply physical, but also psychological, cultural, and political. The world they inhabited was harsh, unforgiving, and dynamic. Kingdoms rose and fell, alliances shifted like the tides, and the outcomes of battles could determine the fates of villages, towns, and entire regions. In this context, the Viking kings were extraordinary figures, capable of inspiring loyalty and fear, of building empires and tearing them apart, and of leaving behind systems of governance and trade that endured long after their deaths. Yet they were also products of their time, shaped by exile, warfare, and opportunity, responding to the pressures and possibilities around them with a combination of instinct, experience, and ambition. Even as the Viking Age drew to a close, and longships ceased to dominate the northern seas, the cultural and political imprint of these kings remained. They influenced law, settlement, trade, and administration, creating structures that would endure in Scandinavia, England, and beyond. Their memory lived on in sagas, myths, and chronicles, where history and legend intertwined, allowing later generations to imagine the vastness of their influence, the drama of their lives, and the enduring human themes of ambition, courage, and the quest for recognition. These stories remind us that history is not just a series of events, but a reflection of human nature, of the ways people wield power, navigate loyalty, and shape the lives of others through action and decision. As you listen to these tales tonight, you might picture the longships cutting through misty waters, the distant echo of horns across fjords, the tension before a raid or a battle, and the quiet moments in the halls of kings where strategy and diplomacy were as crucial as the sword. You may imagine the fear and awe of communities living under the shadow of these men, and the ways in which both terror and governance shaped their daily lives. In this way, the stories of Viking kings become more than history. They become an immersive experience of a world at once brutal, strategic, and endlessly fascinating. And now, as the day comes to a close and the tales of ambition, conquest, and cunning settle into memory, it is time to let your own mind rest. Imagine the fjords quieting, the longships anchored, and the kings and warlords of old fading into the mist of legend. Rest now, traveler, with the knowledge that these stories of human courage, folly, and power will remain, waiting for you whenever you wish to return. Close your eyes and drift, and let the echoes of history lull you into a calm, peaceful sleep. Until we meet again, the sagas remain alive in memory, and the lessons of these terrible Viking kings linger gently, like the fading light over a northern sea. If you have been captivated by this journey through time and the world of the Viking kings, consider subscribing to Boring History for sleep, so we may continue exploring the quiet, immersive corners of history together. There are countless more stories, long and slow, waiting to unfold, and each one is an invitation to wander, imagine, and rest alongside the past.